Ukraine's robots have just forced Russian troops into a pathetic surrender. And the worst of it, at least for Putin, is not a single Ukrainian soldier was involved. On July 9th, the Kyiv Independent reported on a historic operation that saw Ukraine use a combination of FPV and ground drones to storm a Russian position. Conducted by Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, the operation culminated in Ukraine forcing a small collection of Russian troops to surrender to its ground drones. No specific numbers have been provided yet, however, we do know that the operation took place in Kharkiv Oblast. Russia has been pushing into that oblast as of late. The BBC says that it represents one of the 3 fronts in Putin's summer offensive, with Russia having already claimed to have crossed the state border into the oblast. Russia also says that it's managed to capture a border village in Kharkiv, though the BBC says that further gains aren't likely unless Putin dedicates more forces to the oblast. Never mind gains. What Ukraine just pulled off may be enough to start a counter-offensive that allows it to kick Russia out of Kharkiv altogether. The basics of the Ukrainian strike are simple. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade sent a horde of FPV drones and kamikaze ground drones to bombard a Russian position. After several rounds of this bombardment, the Russian soldiers had had enough. With drones exploding all around them, making it impossible for them to get out of their foxhole, they raised the white flag and surrendered. There wasn't a single Ukrainian soldier in sight. Instead, the captured Russians were escorted back to a Ukrainian base using ground robots and likely a small collection of FPV drones hovering overhead to ensure the Russian troops didn't get out of line or attempt to escape. This was a massive win for Ukraine. The Russian holdout it targeted with its drones had previously managed to resist several assaults by Ukrainian units, which makes the drone capture even more remarkable. Ukraine just succeeded with robots where its troops had previously failed. More information comes from the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade's Telegram channel, where the unit posted to announce its success. For the first time in history, the occupiers capitulated to the ground robots of the 3rd Assault, the post blares. Without infantry and without losses, the 3rd Assault carried out an unprecedented operation. The fighters attacked enemy positions in the Kharkiv region, cleared them, and took the occupiers prisoner exclusively with the help of drones and ground robotic complexes. Without infantry and without losses is the headline there. Ukraine just managed to capture some Russian soldiers without putting any of its own troops at risk. In doing so, it may have just come up with a revolutionary new tactic that's going to change the face of the Ukraine war. But more on that later in the video. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade's statement continues. Thus, the enemy fortifications were attacked by FPV and NRK kamikazes. The next robot was already approaching the destroyed dugout when the enemy, in order to avoid being blown up, announced surrender. The occupiers who survived were taken out to our lines by birds and, according to the regulations, were taken prisoner. The positions that had twice failed to be attacked by adjacent units were repulsed by the Troika's robots thanks to clearly planned offensive actions. The cleared fortifications in the forest belt were occupied by our forces. Here we get our first hint of the types of drones used for the operation. Ukraine mentioned Troika robots, which are an interesting choice if these are the same types of Troikas currently in use in several of the world's airports. The Troika is a ground drone that bears more than a passing resemblance to one of the Daleks from Doctor Who. The drone uses natural language processing to enable it to answer basic queries in several languages, including English, Chinese, and Japanese, and is capable of autonomous navigation that allows it to guide itself across terrain and around objects, says Modev. We don't know if the Troika the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade used is the same kind of Troika being used in airports right now. But if it is, that lends a slightly humorous slant to the story. The Troika has gone from guiding lost tourists to their gates to leading surrendering Russian soldiers to Ukraine's strongholds. That's quite an upgrade. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade's Telegram post continues, "This is the work of the NC-13 unit of the Deus Ex Machina Company of the 2nd Assault Battalion, and this is the first confirmed successful assault in modern warfare using exclusively unmanned platforms." That's not all. We also have footage of what Ukraine managed to do. Shared by the Kyiv Independent on July 9th, the video starts by showing one of Ukraine's ground drones hurtling toward a Russian position. The drone has large and thick tires relative to its size, and it's driving along a dirt path. What appeared to be an explosive payload is stored on a center platform, which is protected by a metal cage surrounding the bomb. It soon becomes clear why that explosive is in place. Within seconds, the footage cuts to the Russian holdout to which the drone is driving. Then an explosion. A massive ball of flames engulfs the Russian foxhole as the kamikaze ground drone explodes. At around the 35-second mark, the footage cuts to other types of drones used in the assault, FPV drones. A small aerial drone is seen buzzing around the foxhole the Russians have built for themselves. It doesn't penetrate, instead, it hangs around for a couple of seconds, likely so the operator can confirm they had the right position before it explodes in a ball of fire and smoke. And so it continues. More ground drones make their way to the Russian position, each one arrives, facing no resistance, and explodes. Finally, the footage cuts to the Russians themselves, peeking out of their foxhole. They've crafted a small sign announcing that they wish to surrender. The constant explosions were too much for them. Ukraine accepts the surrender, with the footage then cutting to two of Russia's soldiers lying face down on the ground with their sign next to them. We can assume those soldiers are the ones that Ukraine's drones guided to the Ukrainian position, as a soldier soon arrives to collect them. It's remarkable footage, and it shows just how effective Ukraine can be when assaulting a Russian position with its drones. What we have here is a world first. Without any of its soldiers involved until Russia's surrendering troops arrived at the Ukrainian base, the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade managed to use drones and ground robots to capture some enemies. It shouldn't come as a surprise. Time and time again during the Ukraine war, the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade has proven itself to be one of the most important and innovative that Ukraine has. Formed in 2022, the brigade is a result of the merger between the Azov Special Operations Force, or Azov SSO, which had been created by former Azov battalions in the wake of Putin's initial invasion of Ukraine. Those battalions had been stationed in Mariupol when the city was besieged by Russia's troops. Though that city fell to the invading forces, the remnants of the Azov battalions gathered outside of the city limits and began forming new units of their own in Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv. It didn't take long for Ukraine to realize how invaluable these makeshift units could be if they were organized into a collective force. The Azov SSO was soon integrated into the Special Operations Forces of Ukraine's armed forces and, in January 2023, was merged into an operational combat unit functioning under Ukraine's ground forces. That unit became the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, a collective of well-trained and highly mobile forces capable of carrying out complex operations. The brigade has been key to many Ukrainian successes since. In April 2023, it took part in the liberation of Kherson, in addition to fighting in the ultimately failed defense of Bakhmut. Even though Bakhmut fell, the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade was one of Ukraine's few units to conduct successful offensives against the invading Russian forces in Bakhmut, when it forced Russia's 72nd Brigade to abandon its positions. Fast forward to September 2023, and the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade managed to briefly liberate the small town of Andriivka. Though that settlement eventually fell, the brigade once again marked itself out as being capable of conducting offensives where other Ukrainian ground forces might fail. And then the hits keep on coming. In February 2024, the brigade was transferred to the settlement of Avdiivka, where it claimed to have killed 1,500 Russian troops, injured a further 3,500, and destroyed 20 of Russia's armored vehicles. By May, the brigade was also claiming to have caused up to 600 Russian casualties in the Kharkiv Oblast, where it appears to have been operating for well over a year at this point. In August, the brigade also managed to claim about 1.24 square miles of Kharkiv back from the Russians in a battle that saw its soldiers outnumbered by a rate of 2.5 to 1. This is a group of soldiers that represent the best of the best that Ukraine's ground forces have to offer. They've proved themselves many times over the last few years, and with the footage released on July 9th, they've also shown themselves to be innovators. Soldiers who were already capable of defeating Russian units that were far larger than their own have now come up with ways to capture opposing troops without risking any of their own lives. Putin was terrified of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade before. Now he faces the prospect of a version of the brigade that's capable of causing major damage to his military without any risk to themselves. He's also dealing with what is clearly becoming a trend of Ukraine using ground robots for several purposes as it defends itself against its forces. The July 9th strike and surrender demonstrate that, showcasing how Ukraine uses kamikaze ground drones to attack Russian foxholes and now is using ground drones to escort surrendering Russian soldiers. But Ukraine is also able to use its little ground robots to protect its own troops. That's according to Pravda, which reported back in May that Ukraine has come up with a ground drone capable of evacuating wounded soldiers away from the front lines. Deployed by Ukraine's 13th Katia Brigade, which is part of the country's National Guard, the drone shares several similarities with the drones that the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade used to bomb the Russian soldiers in Kharkiv. It has the same large tracked tires along with a platform. However, the drone is slightly larger and doesn't have a full cage around this platform, which allows an injured soldier to get inside. A Katia soldier who needed medical assistance was put onto a ground robotic complex and successfully delivered to the evacuation team, from where he was taken to the doctors, the brigade claimed when announcing its successful operation. Even more remarkable here is that the drone managed to travel for around 7.4 miles to retrieve the injured soldier and get him back to base. So Ukraine has ground drones. It not only has them, but it's using them in innovative ways to both protect its soldiers and decimate Russia's troops. Here's what this means for the war. First and most importantly, the exploits of Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade have just revealed a new tactic Ukraine can use against Russia as Putin continues his summer offensive. That's key as Russia revamps its tactics as part of that offensive. On July 6th, Politico reported that Ukraine has started building much smaller trenches than the ones used previously during the war. The reason is simple: Russia has switched from launching large human wave assaults supported by mechanized units to using much smaller collections of troops to hit Ukraine. These smaller assaults make Russia's offensive forces more mobile, meaning they can attack targets from multiple angles while stretching Ukraine's defenses. It's an intelligent move that has forced Ukraine to reconsider its approach to its trench-based defenses. However, it's also an approach that creates vulnerabilities. Russia's smaller units of soldiers are digging out their own small trenches and foxholes as they advance, with their plans seeming to be to absorb Ukraine's counterattacks before pushing forward. Perhaps that's what we saw in Kharkiv on July 9th. A small group of Russian soldiers were squirreled away in a foxhole, perhaps believing that they could withstand a Ukrainian ground assault until nightfall, at which point they'd be able to move away. They might have been right. After all, the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade itself says that it attempted several soldier-led raids against the Russian position. It was only after switching to drones that it managed to capture the Russian soldiers. A new tactic has emerged. Rather than risk its people in counter-offensives, Ukraine can send its drones to deliver explosive fury to a Russian position. Those drones don't even need to claim any kills, though it's an obvious bonus if they do. They just need to keep assaulting Russia's foxholes, creating the possibility of the foxhole collapsing to force surrender. And when that surrender comes, Ukraine now knows that it can escort Russia's terrified soldiers back to its bases using its ground drones. The lack of direct troop involvement in this new strategy is also important for another reason. Ukraine is struggling with some manpower issues right now. A lot is made of the fact that Russia has a higher troop casualty rate, and rightly so. Putin's attritional approach means that Russia broached the 1 million casualties mark in June, and is continuing to lose soldiers at a rate of around 1,000 per day. However, Putin's approach is working in the sense that it's slowly whittling away at Ukraine's forces too. Numbers for Ukraine's casualties are a little harder to come by, though the New York Times claimed on June 3rd that one study suggests that between 60,000 and 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since Putin invaded. Adding what is likely several 100,000 who have been injured to that list shows us that Ukraine is being worn down by Russia's attritional war. The Times piece claims the total casualties for the war on both sides sits at 1.4 million. Subtract Russia's 1 million from that number and you get 400,000 total casualties for Ukraine. That isn't a small number, and Ukraine is struggling to plug the gaps. Throughout 2025, several media outlets have reported on Ukraine's struggles to find new soldiers to serve on the front lines. The BBC suggested this was a problem back in February, noting that most Ukrainians who actively wanted to fight against Russia are either dead, injured, or stuck on the front lines waiting to be relieved by new recruits who aren't coming fast enough. In March, US President Donald Trump also claimed that Ukraine was struggling to fill its ranks, telling Zelensky that his country was running low on soldiers during a meeting with the Ukrainian president. Ukraine knows about these recruitment problems. Also in March, it started recruiting people between aged 18 and 24 who want to fight, albeit voluntarily, meaning it's now accepting soldiers who are below the country's conscription age of 25. It's here where Ukraine's new ground-based drone strategy comes into play. Think about what being able to make Russian soldiers surrender using drones means for the future. If Ukraine can build on the work done by the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade to make its groundbreaking approach a standard operation procedure for the rest of the troops, massive pressure will be relieved on Ukraine's army. Its soldiers deal with less risk because drones are doing all of the risky work. The knock-on effect is that fewer Ukrainians are killed at the front, meaning the country doesn't have to worry quite as much about its recruitment woes. Don't get us wrong, Ukraine still needs to solve its soldier shortage. What we're seeing here is the potential evolution of its armed forces that allows Ukraine to substitute drones for people in operations that would have previously required soldiers. It's an evolution that the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, suggests needs to happen, either now or after the Ukraine war ends. It points out that low birth rates and emigration have already done a number on Ukraine's population, dropping it to 37.9 million in 2024 from a past high of 52.5 million in 1991. CSIS says that a future Ukrainian force will need to rely more heavily on drones, using them as replacements for lost soldiers after the Ukraine war and making unmanned vehicles a key part of the country's defensive strategy moving forward. What the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade achieved may be an important step to making that future drone-based army a reality. And given Ukraine's manpower issues, it can't come soon enough. Ukraine is certainly looking for more ways to innovate with its ground robots. Back in April, Forbes writer David Hambling noted that Ukraine has plans to build and field up to 15,000 ground robots in 2025 alone, adding that this shouldn't come as a surprise given the country's personnel shortage. Ukraine has already managed to spend $150 million on these ground drones during the first quarter of 2025, Hambling says, and Ukraine's innovators are introducing new designs for the robots on a nearly weekly basis. On July 5th, Insider said that Ukraine is already using its ground robots to lay mines, attack Russian forces, and evacuate wounded soldiers. It's also coming up with modular robot designs that allow it to put its ground robots together like Lego, so they can serve specific purposes depending on operational needs. The move toward a drone-based army already seems to be underway. Ukraine's 3rd Separate Assault Brigade proved on July 9th that ground drones have uses that nobody could have expected when Putin launched his invasion. And it's not just ground drones that Putin has to worry about. Ukraine has gone full beast mode with its drone production, as it's building 900% more drones now than it was in 2024. Find out how and what this means in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you, as always, for watching.